Tonight, we're exploring what life looked like after the plague, how ordinary people rebuilt their lives, and how one devastating pandemic quietly reshaped the future of Europe. But before we begin, take a second to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment below telling me where you're watching from or what historical topic you'd love to see next. Your support really helps the channel grow. And if you enjoy calm, relaxing history stories like this one, make sure to check out the other videos on the channel as well. Now, dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's step back into the strange world that came after the plague. Now, imagine surviving one of the deadliest disasters in human history, only to wake up in a world that feels completely different. In the mid-1300s, the Black Death swept across Europe, killing tens of millions of people and leaving entire towns silent. Fields were abandoned, families vanished, and for a while, it must have felt like the world itself was ending. But eventually, the plague slowed, the deaths stopped, and the survivors were left with one big question: what happens now? Because when the Black Death finally faded, life didn't just go back to normal. In fact, the years that followed changed society in ways nobody expected. Workers suddenly had power. Old traditions started to crumble. Wealth shifted, revolts erupted, and the medieval world began transforming into something entirely new. Imagine waking up one morning and realizing half the people you once knew are gone, not moved away, not traveling, gone. That was the strange, quiet reality many Europeans faced after the worst years of the Black Death finally passed around 1351. For several years, the plague had swept across the continent like a dark storm that refused to stop moving. It arrived in port cities first, carried by ships and trade routes, then spread inland along roads, rivers, and markets. Wherever it went, death followed, and when it finally slowed, Europe looked like a completely different place. Historians estimate that between 30 and 50% of Europe's population died during the Black Death. In some areas, the losses were even worse. In parts of Italy, entire communities lost half or even 60% of their people. France saw similar devastation. In England, roughly 4 out of every 10 people disappeared within just a few years. Some towns suffered even more. Records from certain villages suggest 70% of the population died. Think about that for a moment. Imagine 10 houses on your street. Now imagine 7 of them suddenly empty. That was not unusual in Europe after the plague. Across the countryside, entire villages simply vanished. Archaeologists today still find evidence of what historians call deserted medieval villages. These are settlements that were once active communities, farms, homes, churches, but were abandoned after the population collapse. Places that had existed for generations suddenly had no one left to live there. In England alone, historians believe thousands of villages disappeared during the late Middle Ages. Some of them were never rebuilt. Nature began reclaiming them almost immediately. Fields that had been carefully plowed year after year slowly returned to grass and wild plants. Farm roads faded into the earth. Stone houses crumbled without anyone to repair their roofs. Within a few decades, it was sometimes hard to tell a village had ever existed at all. The countryside became quieter and stranger. Travelers during this time occasionally described long stretches of road where they saw no people for miles. Churches stood open but empty. Bells that once rang daily for prayer and work had fallen silent. Even animals seemed confused by the sudden disappearance of their owners. Livestock often wandered freely through fields and roads because no one was left to care for them. Sheep grazed unattended. Chickens wandered through abandoned yards. In some places, horses were simply released because their owners had died. You might think surviving such a disaster would feel like winning a terrible lottery. But for many people, the experience was deeply unsettling. Imagine living in a small medieval village where you had known every neighbor since childhood. You knew the baker, the blacksmith, the priest, the family who lived down the road with the loud children and the barking dog. Now imagine half of them suddenly gone. Daily life became filled with reminders of loss. Empty houses, untouched tools, clothes still hanging where someone left them, and sometimes entire homes where everyone inside had died. The psychological impact was enormous. Medieval society was tightly connected. Families lived close together. Communities were small and familiar. The plague shattered those connections. Some survivors spoke of feeling like they were living in a ghost world. But strangely enough, this emptiness also created something unexpected: opportunity. Before the Black Death, Europe had actually been struggling with the opposite problem: too many people. During the 1200s and early 1300s, Europe's population had grown rapidly. Farms were crowded. Land was divided into smaller and smaller pieces among families. Jobs were scarce. Many peasants worked extremely hard just to survive. In some places, people had begun farming land that wasn't very good simply because there were no better options left. Then the plague arrived. And suddenly, the situation flipped completely. Instead of too many people chasing too little land, there was now far more land than people. For those who survived, this created new possibilities that had never existed before. Farmers discovered that abandoned land could sometimes be claimed or rented cheaply. Fields that once belonged to families who had died were now sitting unused. In some villages, surviving peasants simply moved into better houses because the previous owners were gone. Imagine living in a tiny wooden hut your whole life, and then realizing the larger stone house next door has been empty for months. It's a strange thought, but in many places, that's exactly what happened. Landowners faced a similar situation, though from a different angle. Large estates that once depended on hundreds of workers suddenly had only a handful of people left to run them. Fields went unharvested because there were not enough laborers to do the work. Some farms simply stopped producing crops altogether. This was a huge problem for medieval economies, which depended heavily on agriculture. Grain shortages could quickly lead to rising food prices. And remember, medieval farming was already difficult in the best of times. Without enough workers, it became almost impossible to maintain the same level of production. Infrastructure also began to suffer. Bridges were not repaired. Irrigation systems broke down. Mills stopped operating when millers died or fled. The system that had supported medieval life for centuries was suddenly missing millions of people who made it function. Yet the survivors kept moving forward. People still had to eat. They still needed homes, clothing, tools, and trade. Slowly, cautiously, communities began rebuilding themselves. New families formed. Children were born. Markets reopened. Farmers returned to the fields that had not yet been swallowed by weeds. Life did not immediately return to normal. In fact, normal no longer existed. But something else was beginning to take shape. Because while the Black Death had destroyed enormous numbers of lives, it had also broken many of the old rules that controlled medieval society. Land was suddenly available. Labor was suddenly valuable. and the survivors were about to discover that in this strange, half-empty world, they had more power than people like them had ever had before. The quiet after the plague would not last forever. Soon, the balance of medieval society would begin to shift. In the years before the Black Death, life for most workers in Europe was extremely predictable, and not in a good way. If you were born a peasant, you would almost certainly die a peasant. Your parents worked the land, and you would work the same land. Your children would probably do the same after you. That was the basic structure of feudal society. Most peasants did not own the land they farmed. Instead, they lived and worked on property controlled by a lord. In exchange for protection and a place to live, peasants owed labor, crops, and taxes. It was not exactly a flexible career path. If you were unhappy with your situation, you couldn't easily leave. Many peasants were serfs, meaning they were legally tied to the land they worked. They couldn't simply pack their bags and move to another village, offering better pay. And even if they could, there were always plenty of other workers willing to take their place. Labor was cheap. Workers were replaceable. At least that's how things worked before the plague. After the Black Death, everything changed, because suddenly there were far fewer workers than jobs. Fields still needed to be plowed. Crops still needed to be harvested. Buildings needed repair. Livestock needed care. But the people who normally did all that work were gone. Imagine running a large farm that once had 50 workers. Now imagine only 20 of them are still alive. You still have the same land, the same animals, the same responsibilities, but less than half the workforce. Landowners across Europe faced exactly this problem, and they quickly discovered something uncomfortable. The surviving workers now had options. Before the plague, if a peasant complained about conditions or pay, the lord could simply shrug and find someone else. After the plague, finding replacements was much harder. In fact, in many areas, it was nearly impossible. Workers began to realize something important. Their labor had become valuable. Farmhands who once struggled to survive could now ask for higher wages. Skilled workers like blacksmiths, carpenters, and millers became especially valuable because their abilities were difficult to replace. If one lord refused to offer better pay, workers could sometimes travel to another village where the conditions were better. This may sound normal to us today, but in medieval Europe, it was a huge shift. For centuries, most peasants had very little bargaining power. Now, for the first time in generations, they could negotiate. Some farmers began asking for shorter work obligations. Others demanded cash wages instead of traditional labor duties. And many simply moved to places where life seemed easier. Records from England show that agricultural wages rose dramatically after the plague. In some areas, workers earned double what they had before. Imagine the shock this caused among landowners. For generations, they had been used to a system where peasants had very little choice. Now those same peasants were suddenly making demands, and sometimes those demands were being accepted. But the change did not happen overnight. Many lords resisted these shifts as much as they could. They tried to pressure workers into returning to the old system. Some threatened punishment if peasants refused traditional labor duties. Others attempted to lure workers with slightly better offers while still trying to maintain control. But the basic economic reality was hard to ignore. There were simply not enough workers. Picture a busy market where only a few merchants remain, but hundreds of customers still want goods. Those merchants can set the prices. Something similar was happening with labor. The people who could work suddenly held the advantage. This change began quietly undermining one of the most important systems of medieval life: feudalism. Feudalism depended on a large, stable population of peasants who were tied to the land and obligated to serve their lords. But now, peasants were moving around more freely. They were asking for wages. They were negotiating, and in some cases, they were refusing to accept the old rules entirely. To the elites of medieval Europe, this was alarming. If peasants gained too much freedom, the entire social order could begin to unravel. Kings, nobles, and wealthy landowners quickly realized that the labor shortage was not just an economic problem. It was a political problem, because when workers gain power, the balance of society starts to shift, and that shift was already beginning. Across Europe, the survivors of the Black Death were discovering that their work mattered more than ever before. Plowing a field, repairing a roof, forging tools, harvesting grain. These everyday tasks suddenly carried new value, and the people who performed them were beginning to understand their importance. But those in power were not ready to accept this new reality. If wages kept rising and workers kept moving freely, the entire feudal system could collapse. So governments and rulers began searching for ways to stop the change before it went too far. They believed that if they could control wages and limit worker movement, they might restore the old balance. Unfortunately for them, the world had already changed, and trying to force it back to the way it was before the plague would prove much harder than they expected. In fact, the struggle to control labor was about to lead to one of the most dramatic economic experiments of the medieval world, a set of laws designed to freeze wages and force workers back into their old roles. But as we'll see in the next chapter, passing laws is one thing. Making people obey them is something else entirely. By the early 1350s, something unusual was happening across Europe. Workers were starting to ask for more money, and in many cases, they were getting it. For centuries, medieval society had been built on a simple assumption. Peasants would always be available to work the land. Lords owned large estates, and peasants provided the labor needed to make those estates productive. But the Black Death had shattered that balance. Now landowners faced a frustrating new reality. There were plenty of fields, plenty of livestock, and plenty of work to be done, but not nearly enough workers, and the workers who remained knew it. A farm laborer who once had no choice but to accept whatever payment a lord offered could now negotiate. If one lord refused to raise wages, the worker might simply leave and find another farm willing to pay more. This kind of behavior made landowners extremely nervous. From their point of view, the world was starting to feel upside down. Peasants were supposed to obey. They were not supposed to bargain. Even worse, the rising wages threatened the entire economic structure of feudal society. Large estates depended on cheap labor to remain profitable. If workers demanded too much pay, some landowners worried they would struggle to maintain their property. So rulers across Europe began asking an important question. What if the government simply made higher wages illegal? It might sound strange today, but in the medieval world, this seemed like a perfectly reasonable solution. If workers were becoming too expensive, why not just pass laws forcing them to accept their old pay? In England, this idea turned into one of the most famous labor laws of the Middle Ages. In 1351, the English government introduced a law known as the Statute of Labourers. Its purpose was simple: stop wages from rising. The law ordered that workers must accept the same pay they had earned before the Black Death, even though the population had been cut nearly in half. In other words, the government was trying to pretend the plague had never happened. The law also included several strict rules. Workers who were capable of working were required to do so. Refusing work could lead to punishment. Employers were forbidden from offering higher wages than the official limits. And perhaps most importantly, workers were not supposed to leave their home areas in search of better opportunities. The message was clear. Peasants should go back to the way things used to be. On paper, the law looked very firm. In reality, enforcing it turned out to be extremely difficult. Think about the situation from the perspective of a medieval farm owner. If your crops were about to spoil in the field and you only had a few workers available, what would you do? Would you refuse to pay them more simply because the law said so? Or would you quietly offer them better wages to make sure the harvest actually happened? Many landowners chose the second option. After all, losing an entire crop would cost far more than paying workers a little extra. This meant the statute of laborers was often ignored. Workers continued moving around in search of better pay. Employers continued secretly offering higher wages when they needed labor badly enough. Local officials did try to enforce the law. Records show that some workers were fined or punished for demanding higher wages, but enforcement was inconsistent. In many villages, everyone understood the reality. The labor shortage was real, and the old wage levels no longer made sense. In fact, the law sometimes made things even more frustrating. Workers resented being forced to accept wages that no longer reflected their value, and employers disliked the restrictions because they needed flexibility to keep their farms running. Instead of restoring order, the law often created tension. It was like trying to hold back a rising tide with a wooden fence. The deeper problem was that governments were trying to control something larger than themselves: basic supply and demand. There were fewer workers available, so the value of work increased. No matter what the law said, that economic reality was difficult to erase. Over time, many people simply found ways around the rules. Some wages were paid in unofficial bonuses. Others were disguised as gifts or additional food allowances, and some workers simply moved far enough away that local officials had trouble tracking them. But the attempt to control wages revealed something important. The ruling elites of medieval Europe were becoming increasingly worried. They feared that if peasants gained too much economic power, it might lead to something even more dangerous: political demands. And as the years passed, that fear would begin to look very justified, because rising wages were not the only problem facing medieval rulers. The decades after the Black Death also brought new taxes, new pressures, and growing frustration among the lower classes. Many peasants believed that if their labor was now more valuable, their lives should improve as well. But governments and nobles were still trying to protect the old system. That tension created a slow-burning conflict, and eventually, it exploded. Within a few decades, angry peasants would march into cities, confront nobles, and demand dramatic changes to the way society worked. The balance of power in medieval Europe was beginning to shift, and the people at the bottom of society were starting to push back. At first, the changes after the Black Death were quiet. Workers asked for higher wages. Landowners complained. Governments passed laws that tried to freeze everything in place. But beneath the surface, frustration was growing. Because while the plague had changed the economic reality of Europe, many rulers were still trying to force society back into its old shape. Peasants were being told to accept lower wages. They were being ordered to stay in their villages. And in some places, taxes were actually rising. You can probably guess how well that combination worked. Not very well. The survivors of the Black Death had seen the world turned upside down. They had watched neighbors, family members, priests, and nobles all die in the same terrible wave of disease. That experience changed how many people thought about authority. If half the population could disappear in a few years, maybe the old social order wasn't as permanent as everyone once believed. And slowly, in different parts of Europe, peasants began to push back. One of the earliest and most violent uprisings happened in France in 1358. It became known as the Jacquerie. The name came from a common nickname nobles used for peasants, Jacques, which was basically the medieval version of calling someone Average Joe. The revolt started during a time of crisis. France was already struggling with the 100 Years' War against England. Armies moved through the countryside, raiding villages and destroying crops. Peasants felt trapped. They were paying taxes to support the war. Their homes were being damaged by soldiers. And at the same time, nobles still expected them to provide labor and obedience. Eventually, anger boiled over. Groups of peasants began attacking manor houses and noble estates. Some castles were looted or burned. Records describe peasants arming themselves with farm tools, axes, and whatever weapons they could find. For a brief moment, it looked like a massive social rebellion might sweep through the countryside. But the revolt did not last long. French nobles organized armed forces and quickly crushed the uprising. Thousands of peasants were killed during the retaliation. The Jacquerie ended brutally, yet the message it sent was impossible to ignore. Peasants were no longer quietly accepting their place at the bottom of society, and similar tensions appeared elsewhere. The most famous of these revolts happened about 2 decades later in England in 1381. This event is now known as the Peasants' Revolt. To understand why it happened, we need to look at something medieval governments loved very much: taxes. England had been fighting France for years, and wars were extremely expensive. Armies needed weapons, ships, supplies, and soldiers. To pay for it all, the government introduced a tax known as the poll tax. Unlike many other taxes, this one charged the same amount to every adult, regardless of wealth. In theory, that might sound fair. In reality, it meant poor peasants were paying the same tax as wealthy landowners. You can imagine how that went over. By the early summer of 1381, anger was spreading across southeastern England. Villages refused to pay the tax. Tax collectors were chased away, sometimes violently. Then something remarkable happened. Thousands of peasants began marching toward London. They were not just angry, they were organized. One of the leaders of the movement was a man named Wat Tyler. Not much is known about his early life, but during the revolt he quickly became one of its central figures. Alongside him was a radical preacher named John Ball, who delivered fiery speeches questioning the fairness of medieval society. One of his famous lines reportedly asked, "When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman?" In simpler words, he was saying, if all humans came from the same original ancestors, why should some people be nobles, while others were peasants? It was a dangerous question, and thousands of people were ready to hear it. As the rebels marched toward London, their demands became clear. They wanted an end to serfdom, fair wages for their work, lower taxes, and greater freedom to move and work where they pleased. When the rebels reached London, the situation became chaotic. Some city gates were opened to them, possibly by sympathetic locals. Large crowds flooded into the capital. Government buildings were attacked. Some officials connected to the hated taxes were captured and executed. For a moment, it looked like the revolt might completely overturn the English government. King Richard II, who was only a teenager at the time, eventually agreed to meet the rebels. During negotiations outside the city, Wat Tyler presented the peasants' demands. Accounts of what happened next vary slightly, but during the tense meeting, Tyler was suddenly attacked by one of the king's officials and killed. Without their leader, the rebellion quickly began to collapse. The king promised reforms at first, but once control was restored, those promises were withdrawn. The revolt was crushed. Many rebels were punished or executed. Yet even though the peasants' revolt failed in the short term, it revealed something important. The old medieval hierarchy was under pressure. Peasants were no longer passive. They were aware that their labor mattered more than ever, and they were willing to challenge authority when they felt the system was unfair. Across Europe, similar unrest appeared again and again in the decades after the Black Death. Urban workers protested wages. Rural peasants resisted labor restrictions. Guild members argued over economic control in growing cities. The plague had not just reduced the population, it had changed how people saw their place in the world. And once that shift in thinking began, it was very difficult to reverse. The balance between peasants and nobles had started to move. But the changes coming next would affect something even more fundamental to medieval life: the land itself, because when half the workers disappear, the way land is used has to change too. When the Black Death swept across Europe, it did not just remove people from society, it removed workers from the land. And in medieval Europe, land was everything. Nearly the entire economy depended on agriculture. Grain fields, vegetable plots, vineyards, orchards, and livestock farms supported both rural villages and growing cities. If the land stopped producing food, the whole system could begin to collapse. Before the plague, most farmland was extremely busy. Large estates required many hands to keep things running. Fields needed to be plowed, planted, weeded, harvested, and repaired year after year. But after the Black Death, landowners faced a strange and frustrating situation. They still owned the same amount of land, but they no longer had enough people to work it. Imagine managing an estate with hundreds of acres of farmland, and suddenly losing half the workers who maintained it. The fields didn't disappear. The crops didn't stop growing. But the people who handled all that labor were gone. In many places, land simply went unused. Travelers during the late 1300s sometimes described abandoned farmland where weeds grew waist-high. Irrigation systems broke down without maintenance. Fences collapsed. Farm roads slowly disappeared under grass. Entire stretches of countryside were left untouched for years. This was not because landowners suddenly became lazy. It was because they literally could not find enough workers. So landowners had to start thinking differently. If there weren't enough peasants to farm huge grain fields, maybe the land could be used in another way. And that idea led to one of the biggest agricultural changes of the late medieval period. Many estates began converting farmland into pasture. Instead of growing crops that required constant labor, landowners started raising animals, especially sheep. Sheep had several advantages. First, they required far fewer workers. A single shepherd could manage large flocks that grazed naturally on open land. Second, sheep produced something extremely valuable: wool. And during the late Middle Ages, Wool was one of Europe's most important economic products. The textile industry was expanding quickly, especially in regions like Flanders, parts of northern Italy, and England. Cloth production required enormous amounts of wool, and the demand for high-quality wool remained strong. So raising sheep became an attractive alternative to labor-intensive farming. Instead of hiring dozens of workers to plant and harvest grain, a landowner could maintain sheep pastures with only a few people. It was a simple economic decision: less labor, more profit. In England, this shift became especially noticeable. Large areas of farmland were converted into grazing land for sheep. In fact, wool production became so important that later writers jokingly described England as a place where sheep ate men. That phrase sounds dramatic, but it reflects a real transformation. Land that once supported villages and grain farming was increasingly being used for wool production. And because sheep needed open space to graze, some settlements were gradually abandoned or absorbed into large pastures. But not all landowners focused on livestock. Another strategy also became popular: leasing land to tenant farmers. Instead of directly managing large estates, some lords began dividing their land into smaller plots that could be rented out. Peasants or independent farmers would pay rent, often in money rather than labor, and manage the land themselves. This arrangement benefited both sides. Landowners still received income from their property, and farmers gained more independence than they had under the old system. Instead of working unpaid labor days for a lord, many peasants now operated more like small-scale business owners. They paid rent, but they controlled their own work. Over time, these changes slowly weakened the traditional feudal structure. Under feudalism, peasants were tied to the land and owed labor directly to a lord. But when land was rented out, and payments were made with money instead of labor, the relationship began to change. Economic relationships were becoming more flexible, more modern, in a way. There was also another unexpected result of all this abandoned land. The environment began to shift. When farmland was left unused, forests and grasslands started expanding again. Animals that had been pushed out by agriculture slowly returned. Historians believe that parts of Europe actually experienced temporary rewilding after the Black Death. Deer, wild boar, and other animals became more common in some regions where farmland had once dominated the landscape. For a time, nature quietly reclaimed pieces of the medieval world. But while the countryside was changing, something else was happening among the surviving population. Opportunity was spreading. With land available and wages rising, some peasants began improving their lives in ways that would have been nearly impossible before the plague. A farm worker might rent a small piece of land. A skilled craftsman might start his own workshop. Merchants faced less competition because so many businesses had disappeared during the plague years. Slowly, almost quietly, a new social group was beginning to grow. People who were not nobles, but were no longer trapped in the poorest levels of society either. The medieval world had long been divided into rigid layers: kings, nobles, clergy, peasants. But after the Black Death, those layers were starting to blur. Because when opportunity appears in a half-empty world, some people rise faster than anyone expects. And in the next chapter, we'll see how the survivors of the plague began building something that medieval Europe had never really seen before: a growing middle class. For most of the Middle Ages, European society was built like a tall, rigid ladder. At the very top were kings and queens. Below them came powerful nobles who controlled huge areas of land. Then came knights, clergy, and wealthy merchants in certain cities. And at the bottom, far below everyone else, were peasants. This system had been fairly stable for centuries. Your place in society was usually decided the moment you were born. If your parents were peasants, your future was already mapped out. Work the land, pay taxes, live under the authority of a lord. Repeat. Climbing the social ladder was extremely rare, but the Black Death shook that ladder so violently that some of its rungs began to loosen. When half the population disappears, the rules that kept society locked in place start to break down. And suddenly, opportunities appear where none existed before. One of the biggest changes was access to land. As we saw in the previous chapter, many farms and properties were left abandoned after the plague. Some landowners could not manage their estates anymore, while others struggled to find workers, so they began offering land for rent or sale. For peasants who survived the plague, this created a strange new possibility: owning or controlling land. Before the plague, that idea was almost impossible for most peasants. Land was tightly controlled by nobles and large estates. After the plague, the shortage of people meant land was suddenly easier to acquire. Some peasants began renting larger plots and running small farms themselves. Others bought land that had been left behind by families who had died. These farmers were no longer just laborers. They were becoming independent producers. And that gave them something extremely important: economic power. A successful farmer who controlled a decent amount of land could produce surplus crops, sell them at markets, and slowly accumulate wealth. Not noble-level wealth, of course, but far more than a traditional peasant family would have expected a century earlier. At the same time, changes were happening in towns and cities. Urban populations had also been devastated by the Black Death. Entire workshops had closed because their owners died. Skilled craftsmen disappeared from guilds. Markets lost merchants. For the survivors, this meant less competition. Imagine you were a skilled carpenter in a medieval city before the plague. There might have been dozens of carpenters competing for work. After the plague, half of them might be gone. Suddenly your skills are much more valuable. You can charge higher prices. You might even expand your workshop and hire assistants. The same thing happened with blacksmiths, masons, cloth makers, bakers, and many other trades. Cities slowly filled with craftsmen who were doing better than earlier generations had. Merchants also benefited from the new economic environment. Trade networks had been disrupted during the worst plague years, but they gradually reopened, with fewer competitors and rising demand for goods. Merchants who survived the crisis often found themselves in a strong position. They could rebuild businesses, expand trade routes, and sometimes accumulate impressive wealth. Over time, these groups, successful farmers, skilled craftsmen, merchants, and traders, began forming something medieval Europe had not fully developed before: a middle class. These people were not nobles, but they were also not poor peasants struggling just to survive. They occupied the middle ground, and that middle ground slowly grew larger during the late 1300s and 1400s. You might be wondering why this mattered so much. Well, a large middle class changes how society works. When wealth and opportunity are spread across more people, power becomes less concentrated at the very top. Successful merchants could influence city governments. Guild leaders could shape economic rules in towns. Independent farmers could negotiate with landlords instead of simply obeying them. This did not mean medieval society suddenly became fair or equal. Far from it. Nobles still held enormous power. Kings still controlled armies. peasants still faced many restrictions. But the strict divide between noble and peasant was becoming less absolute. Money, skills, and opportunity were starting to matter more. This shift was especially noticeable in cities. Urban life was always somewhat different from rural life. Cities tended to have more freedom, more trade, and more economic movement. After the Black Death, cities became magnets for opportunity. Young workers from rural areas often moved there in search of better wages. Craft guilds expanded their influence. Markets grew busier again. Places like Florence, Venice, Paris, and London slowly rebuilt their populations and economies. And with that growth came new ideas about wealth, work, and success. In earlier centuries, social rank was mostly determined by birth, but in the late medieval period, people were beginning to see that skill, trade, and business could also shape a person's future. This mindset would eventually help fuel some of the biggest cultural and economic transformations in European history. The rise of banking families, the growth of powerful merchant cities, the explosion of art and learning during the Renaissance. But those developments were still a little way off. For now, Europe was still recovering from the shock of the plague. Cities were slowly rebuilding. Rural communities were adjusting to new economic realities, and people were trying to figure out how life should work in a world that had lost millions of its inhabitants. The quiet after the plague had created space for change, and nowhere was that change more visible than in the cities that were beginning to wake back up. When the Black Death first swept through Europe, cities were hit especially hard. Medieval cities were crowded places. Houses were packed tightly together. Streets were narrow. Waste disposal was, let's say, not exactly modern. In other words, cities were the perfect environment for disease. When the plague arrived in places like Florence, Paris, London, and Venice, it spread quickly through the population. In some areas, half the residents died within a few months. Entire neighborhoods fell silent. Workshops closed because their owners had died. Markets shrank dramatically. Some city governments even struggled to function because so many officials were gone. In the immediate aftermath, cities felt eerie. Imagine walking through a once busy medieval marketplace and hearing almost nothing. Shops that once sold bread, cloth, tools, and spices were empty. Homes sat abandoned. Streets that used to be crowded with carts and traders now had only a few people moving through them. For survivors, the city must have felt like a ghost of its former self. But cities also had something important that helped them recover. Opportunity, even though the population had collapsed. Cities still had infrastructure that rural villages didn't. They had ports, markets, guilds, trade routes, and established systems for commerce. As Europe slowly stabilized after the worst plague years, these systems began to restart. At first, the recovery was slow. Merchants had to rebuild their supply networks. Craftsmen needed apprentices and workers again. City governments had to reorganize their administration. But gradually, people began returning to urban life. Some of these newcomers were survivors from nearby villages. Rural workers who had lost families or farms sometimes moved to cities looking for new opportunities. Others were younger people who saw cities as places where wages were higher and economic mobility was possible. Remember the labor shortage we talked about earlier? Cities felt that shortage just as strongly as farms did. Guilds, which organized skilled trades like carpentry, metalworking, weaving, and baking, suddenly found themselves missing many members. Workshops that once had large staffs now struggled to fill positions, so they started accepting new workers. For ambitious young people, this created a path into skilled professions that had once been difficult to enter. A peasant who might have spent their entire life farming could now apprentice as a craftsman in a city workshop. That kind of shift may not sound dramatic today, but in the medieval world, it was a big deal. Cities also offered something that rural life rarely provided: cash wages. In the countryside, many peasants were still tied to systems where labor obligations or crop shares formed the basis of payment, but urban economies relied much more on money. A carpenter might be paid for building a house. A mason might earn wages for repairing a wall. A dock worker might be paid for loading ships. This money-based system allowed people to accumulate savings and participate more actively in markets. As urban populations slowly recovered, markets began to grow again. Merchants restarted trade with nearby regions. Ships returned to busy ports. Market stalls filled once more with grain, fish, cloth, wine, spices, and countless other goods. Trade routes that had slowed during the worst years of the plague began to pulse with life again. One city that recovered particularly well was Florence in Italy. Florence had suffered terribly during the Black Death, losing a huge portion of its population. But it was also one of Europe's most economically dynamic cities. Florence was famous for its banking and textile industries. Even after the devastation of the plague, those industries slowly restarted. Banking families expanded their financial networks across Europe. Textile workshops began producing cloth again for both local and international markets. By the late 1300s, Florence was once again a major economic center. Other cities followed similar patterns. Venice, which had long dominated Mediterranean trade, rebuilt its merchant fleets and continued its role as a gateway between Europe and Asia. London recovered gradually as merchants and workers filled its streets again. Paris, despite war and plague outbreaks, remained one of the largest cities in Europe. These urban recoveries were not always smooth. Cities still faced recurring outbreaks of plague in the decades after the Black Death. Whenever a new wave appeared, populations could drop again. Urban life also came with tensions. As more workers arrived looking for opportunity, competition sometimes increased. Guilds argued over who could join their ranks. Skilled workers tried to protect their economic advantages. In some cities, tensions between wealthy merchants and poorer laborers occasionally led to unrest. A famous example occurred in Florence in 1378 during an uprising known as the Ciompi Revolt. The Ciompi were wool workers who felt excluded from the city's powerful guild system. Even though the wool industry was extremely important to Florence's economy, many laborers who worked in that industry had little political representation. Frustration built over time. Eventually, large crowds of workers rose up and temporarily took control of parts of the city government. For a brief period, they attempted to create a more inclusive political system. But like many medieval revolts, the movement eventually collapsed, and the traditional elites regained control. Still, the revolt revealed something important. Urban populations were becoming more politically aware. Workers and craftsmen were beginning to see themselves as groups with shared interests and collective power. Cities were no longer just places of trade. They were becoming centers of political energy and social change. Another key feature of city life during this period was the growing importance of guilds. Guilds were organizations that regulated specific trades. A guild might represent bakers, blacksmiths, weavers, or merchants. These groups controlled training, quality standards, pricing, and sometimes even political influence. To become a full member of a guild, a worker usually had to go through a long process. First came an apprenticeship, where a young worker learned the trade from a master craftsman. After several years, the apprentice could become a journeyman, working for wages and improving their skills. Finally, if they produced a high-quality masterpiece and met guild requirements, they might be allowed to open their own workshop as a master. Guilds helped maintain professional standards, but they also limited competition. Membership was often restricted, which meant skilled trades remained relatively exclusive. Still, during the post-plague period, guilds needed new members to replace those lost to the disease. This allowed more people to enter skilled professions than might have been possible earlier. Urban rebuilding also meant rebuilding physical spaces. Damaged buildings had to be repaired. Roads and bridges needed maintenance. Markets were reorganized. Construction projects created jobs for masons, carpenters, roofers, and laborers. Over time, cities began to feel alive again. Markets filled with voices. Church bells rang across crowded neighborhoods. Ships arrived at docks loaded with goods. But the cities that emerged after the Black Death were not identical to the ones that existed before. They were more economically flexible. Workers had more bargaining power. Trade networks were expanding in new directions. And the rising middle class we talked about earlier was becoming especially visible in urban environments. Successful merchants built impressive homes. Craft guild leaders gained political influence. Banking families accumulated wealth that sometimes rivaled that of nobles. In places like Florence and Venice, this concentration of wealth would soon begin funding something remarkable: art, architecture, education, intellectual exploration. In other words, the cultural explosion that historians now call the Renaissance. The rebuilding of cities after the Black Death did more than restore economic activity. It helped create the conditions for one of the most creative periods in European history. But while cities were rebuilding their economies and populations, something deeper was happening inside people's minds. The plague had not only destroyed lives, it had shaken faith. For many survivors, the disaster raised uncomfortable questions about religion, suffering, and the power of the Church. Before the Black Death, religion shaped nearly every part of life in medieval Europe. The Catholic Church was not just a spiritual institution. It was a powerful social force that guided politics, education, culture, and daily behavior. Most people believed the Church held the answers to life's biggest questions. Why are we here? What happens after we die? How do we avoid eternal punishment? The Church explained the world through a religious framework. Good things happened because of God's blessing. Bad things often meant punishment for sin. And when the Black Death arrived, many people immediately looked to religion for help. At first, the reaction was exactly what you might expect. People prayed, a lot. Churches filled with frightened worshippers, asking for divine protection. Entire communities held public prayers and religious processions through city streets. In many towns, priests led crowds in asking God to remove the terrible disease that was sweeping across Europe. But the plague did not stop. Families prayed desperately while watching their loved ones fall sick. Entire households died even after hours of prayer and confession. And something else deeply troubling began to happen. Priests themselves started dying in huge numbers. Clergy were often among the most exposed members of society during the plague. When someone fell ill, priests were called to provide last rites and spiritual comfort. This meant they frequently visited infected homes. and many of them caught the disease. Some regions lost enormous portions of their clergy. Parish churches suddenly had no priest. Monasteries lost dozens of monks. For people who believed the church stood between humanity and divine judgment, this was frightening. If even holy men were dying like everyone else, what did that mean? Over time, these experiences began to shake confidence in the church's authority. Not everyone lost faith, of course. Many survivors actually became more religious after witnessing so much death. But for others, the plague created serious doubts. If God controlled everything, why allow such destruction? Why did the plague kill children, priests, and devout believers just as easily as criminals? Why did prayer seem powerless against the disease? These questions did not have easy answers. And in the absence of clear explanations, new religious movements began to appear. One of the most dramatic responses was the rise of flagellant movements. Flagellants were groups of people who believed the plague was a punishment from God for humanity's sins. Their solution was simple: public penance. Large groups of flagellants traveled from town to town performing dramatic rituals. They marched through streets while chanting prayers, sometimes whipping themselves with leather cords or metal-tipped scourges. Yes, literally whipping themselves. The idea was that by suffering voluntarily, they could show repentance and convince God to end the plague. These processions attracted huge crowds. In some areas, entire towns gathered to watch or join the ritual. Too many frightened people, the flagellants seemed deeply devoted and sincere. But the church leadership quickly became uneasy. The problem was not the idea of repentance. The church already encouraged confession and penance. The problem was that the flagellants were operating outside church authority. They organized their own rituals, preached their own interpretations of divine punishment, and sometimes criticized clergy for failing to stop the plague. Eventually, church officials condemned the movement. In 1349, Pope Clement VI officially banned the flagellants, arguing that their activities encouraged disorder and false teachings. But even after the ban, the movement continued in some places for years. It revealed how desperate people were to find meaning in the catastrophe. Not all religious responses were so dramatic. Some were quieter, but equally important. During the late 1300s, mystical religious practices became more popular. Mystics focused on personal spiritual experiences rather than formal church rituals. They believed individuals could form direct emotional connections with God through prayer, meditation, and contemplation. Mystical writings often described intense visions, spiritual journeys, and personal encounters with divine presence. For people who felt traditional institutions had failed to explain the plague, these personal spiritual paths could feel more meaningful. Several famous mystics emerged during this period. One example is Julian of Norwich, an Englishwoman who wrote about her visions during a severe illness in the late 1300s. Her writings focused on themes of divine love and compassion, offering comfort in a world still recovering from the trauma of the plague. Another important figure was Catherine of Siena, an Italian mystic whose writings and political influence would later make her one of the most famous religious voices of the period. These mystical traditions did not reject Christianity, but they shifted focus away from strict institutional authority and toward personal spiritual experience. Meanwhile, other groups took a more critical view of the church itself. Some thinkers began questioning whether the church hierarchy had become too wealthy or too politically involved. Criticism of the clergy slowly grew. Writers and preachers pointed out examples of corruption, luxury, or moral failure among some church officials. To be fair, many clergy were deeply devoted and served their communities bravely during the plague. But the enormous loss of experienced priests created another problem. The church suddenly needed to replace thousands of clergy members. In some cases, new priests were appointed quickly, with limited training simply to fill empty positions. This sometimes lowered the overall level of education and preparation among the clergy, and people noticed. Complaints about poorly trained or ineffective priests became more common in certain regions. All of these factors combined to create a subtle but important shift in European religious life. The church was still powerful. Christian belief remained central to society, but confidence in religious institutions was no longer as unquestioned as it had been before the Black Death. Seeds of doubt had been planted, and over the next century, those seeds would grow. Historians often point out that the spiritual tensions following the Black Death helped set the stage for major religious transformations later on. The Protestant Reformation, which would begin in the early 1500s, did not happen overnight. It grew from centuries of debates, criticisms, and shifting attitudes toward religious authority. The plague was not the only cause, but it played an important role in shaking people's assumptions about how the world worked. When millions die despite constant prayer, people start asking new questions, and those questions can slowly reshape entire belief systems. Yet, religion was not the only area where fear and uncertainty produced dark consequences. During and after the plague, many communities struggled to understand where the disease came from. Without scientific explanations, some people looked for someone to blame. And tragically, that search for blame led to waves of violence against innocent groups. When the worst waves of the plague finally subsided in the later decades of the 14th century, Europe did not simply return to the religious life it had known before. The world had changed too profoundly. Entire towns had been emptied. Priests, monks, and bishops had died in astonishing numbers. Families had buried half their members. The faithful had prayed desperately for deliverance, yet the plague had come anyway. In the aftermath, people were left with questions that were both deeply personal and profoundly theological. Why had God allowed such suffering? Why had the prayers of the faithful seemed unanswered? And why had so many religious leaders perished alongside the people they were meant to guide? The spiritual consequences of the Black Death would ripple across Europe for centuries, gradually reshaping religious practice, weakening some traditional institutions, and planting the seeds for later movements that would eventually culminate in the Protestant Reformation. To understand what happened after the plague ended, we must look not only at politics and economics, but at faith itself, because in medieval Europe, religion was the framework through which people understood everything. Before the plague, the Catholic Church stood at the center of European life. It was not merely a religious institution, but a powerful social, political, and cultural force. Priests baptized children, blessed marriages, heard confessions, and presided over burials. Monasteries controlled vast lands, bishops advised kings, and the Pope commanded immense spiritual authority. Most people believed that the Church was the bridge between humanity and God. But the Black Death shook that belief. During the worst outbreaks, clergy members were often among the first to die. Parish priests continued administering last rites to the sick, visiting homes filled with infection, and hearing final confessions from plague victims. Many paid for this devotion with their lives. In some regions, entire monastic communities were wiped out. The loss created an immediate crisis. Parishes that had once been served by experienced priests suddenly found themselves without spiritual leadership. Bishops, desperate to fill the vacancies, began ordaining new clergy at unprecedented speed. But many of these replacements were poorly trained. Young men who had received only minimal theological education were thrust into positions that had once required years of preparation. Some could barely read Latin. Others struggled to properly perform the rituals that defined medieval religious life. To ordinary believers, this decline in quality was noticeable. Sermons became less sophisticated, confessions less structured, religious instruction weaker. In the eyes of many lay people, the authority and prestige of the clergy had been quietly diminished. Beyond institutional problems lay a deeper spiritual challenge. The plague had confronted people with suffering on a scale that was almost impossible to comprehend. Entire families had died within days. Healthy individuals had collapsed suddenly in the streets. Children had watched parents perish, and parents had buried their children. And through it all, people had prayed. Church bells rang constantly for prayers. Communities held processions asking for divine mercy. People confessed sins in hopes of appeasing God's wrath. Yet the plague spread regardless. For some, the disaster reinforced their belief that humanity was deeply sinful and deserving of punishment. The plague, they believed, had been a divine warning, a reminder of the need for repentance. But for others, the experience raised troubling doubts. If the Church truly held the keys to salvation, why had its own clergy died in such numbers? Why had the prayers of entire communities failed to stop the disease? These questions were rarely spoken openly. Medieval society was still deeply religious, and open criticism of the Church could be dangerous. But quietly, in private conversations and personal reflections, many people began to reconsider their relationship with faith. The rise of personal piety, one of the most important changes after the Black Death, was a shift toward more personal forms of religious devotion. Instead of relying solely on priests and church institutions, many believers began seeking more direct spiritual experiences. This trend was not entirely new. Even before the plague, movements emphasizing personal spirituality had existed. But the trauma of the Black Death accelerated the shift dramatically. Lay people began forming small devotional groups that met outside the formal structure of the church. These groups focused on prayer, meditation, and the reading of religious texts in the local language rather than Latin. Books of devotion, known as Books of Hours, became especially popular among the emerging middle classes. These private prayer books allowed individuals to follow structured daily prayers in their own homes. For many survivors of the plague, faith had become something more intimate. Religion was no longer only something that happened in a church building under the guidance of clergy. It was something that individuals carried with them into their daily lives. The flagellant movement, not all responses to the plague were quiet or introspective. Some people reacted with dramatic public displays of repentance. Across parts of Europe, groups known as flagellants began appearing in towns and cities. These men traveled from place to place in organized processions, whipping themselves with cords and chains in public as an act of penance. They believed the plague was God's punishment for humanity's sins, and that only extreme repentance could persuade God to lift the suffering. Flagellant groups often marched through cities barefoot, chanting hymns while beating their backs until blood ran down their skin. At first, many communities welcomed them. Their dramatic displays seemed to offer hope that divine forgiveness might finally come. But church authorities soon grew uneasy. The flagellants operated outside official church structures, and their popularity threatened to undermine clerical authority. Some groups also began preaching ideas that contradicted church doctrine. Eventually, the Pope condemned the movement, but the flagellants had already revealed something important. Many people were searching for spiritual answers beyond the traditional institutions that had once defined religious life. New religious voices. The years after the Black Death also saw the rise of reform-minded religious thinkers who criticized corruption within the church. One of the most famous was John Wycliffe, an English theologian who argued that the church had become too wealthy and politically powerful. He believed that Scripture, not church hierarchy, should be the ultimate authority in matters of faith. Wycliffe also supported translating the Bible into English so that ordinary people could read it themselves. His followers, known as Lollards, spread his ideas throughout England despite fierce opposition from church authorities. In Bohemia, another reformer named Jan Hus preached similar ideas. He condemned corruption among clergy and argued for greater spiritual equality among believers. Hus's teachings would later inspire a religious movement that challenged the church directly, decades before the Protestant Reformation began. While these reformers did not emerge solely because of the Black Death, the atmosphere created by the plague made their ideas resonate more strongly. People who had already begun questioning traditional authority were more willing to listen. Wealth, death, and the church the Black Death also had financial consequences for the church. In the aftermath of the plague, large numbers of people left property and money to religious institutions in their wills. Many believed that generous donations might help secure their salvation or shorten time spent in purgatory. At first, this influx of wealth strengthened the church financially, but over time it created resentment. Some critics argued that church leaders had become too focused on wealth rather than spiritual guidance. Luxurious lifestyles among high-ranking clergy only fueled these perceptions. For ordinary believers who had endured unimaginable loss during the plague years, displays of wealth by religious officials could feel deeply out of touch. These tensions would simmer for generations. The changing meaning of death, the Black Death, also reshaped how Europeans thought about death itself. Before the plague, death had often been portrayed in religious art as a solemn but orderly transition from life to the afterlife. After the plague, artistic imagery became darker and more vivid. The famous Dance of Death motif began appearing across Europe in murals, paintings, and manuscripts. These images depicted skeletons leading people of all social classes, kings, bishops, merchants, and peasants, in a grim procession toward the grave. The message was simple and unsettling. Death spared no one. This imagery reflected a society that had witnessed mortality on an unprecedented scale. It also reinforced a powerful spiritual idea that every person, regardless of status, ultimately faced the same fate. In this way, the plague subtly reshaped religious imagination. Faith became more focused on the fragility of life and the urgency of spiritual preparation. Seeds of the Reformation, the Black Death, did not cause the Protestant Reformation directly, but it helped create the conditions that made the Reformation possible. By weakening confidence in traditional religious authorities, encouraging personal forms of devotion, and amplifying criticism of church corruption, the plague reshaped the spiritual landscape of Europe. Over the next century and a half, these trends would continue to grow. By the early 16th century, figures like Martin Luther would ignite movements that permanently divided Western Christianity. When Luther nailed his famous theses to the church door in 1517, he was responding to problems that had been developing for generations. Some of those problems could be traced back to the aftermath of the Black Death, a faith transformed. In the years after the plague ended, Europe remained a deeply religious society. Churches still stood at the center of towns. Bells still rang to mark the rhythms of prayer. Pilgrimages continued, and religious festivals filled the calendar. But beneath this continuity lay subtle changes. People trusted institutions a little less. They sought spiritual meaning more personally. They listened more carefully to voices that challenged established authority. The Black Death had not destroyed faith, but it had transformed it. And in the centuries that followed, that transformation would help reshape the religious history of the entire continent. The Black Death was not only a spiritual and social catastrophe, it was a wake-up call about human vulnerability. For the first time, many Europeans confronted the limits of their medical knowledge and began thinking, however haltingly, about public health in ways that would shape the future. Before the plague, medieval medicine was a mixture of herbal remedies, ancient theories, religious ritual, and guesswork. Physicians relied heavily on the ideas of Greek and Roman thinkers like Galen and Hippocrates, who believed that the human body was governed by humors blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Disease was thought to result from imbalances in these humors, bad air miasmas, or divine punishment. Treatments included bloodletting, purging, prayers, and sometimes the occasional magical charm. For most ordinary people, medical care was rudimentary at best. Rural villages might have had a barber surgeon or a healer who worked with herbs. Cities sometimes had trained physicians, but their understanding of disease was extremely limited. There was no concept of bacteria, viruses, or germ theory. Contagion was poorly understood. People often blamed bad smells, divine wrath, or celestial alignments for sickness. When the plague struck, these limitations became painfully obvious. Entire towns lost huge proportions of their populations despite prayers, charms, and treatments. Physicians themselves were not immune. Many of the best-trained doctors died alongside their patients, reinforcing the terrifying sense that medicine had failed. Early observations and theories, despite their limited understanding, some doctors began to notice patterns. They realized that plague victims could spread disease to others. They observed that people living in crowded conditions or near the sick were more likely to become ill. Certain practices, like isolating the infected, seemed to reduce the spread. In some Italian cities, officials began experimenting with rudimentary quarantine measures. Venice, which had long been a major Mediterranean trading hub, became particularly notable in its response. Venetian authorities required ships arriving from plague-affected ports to anchor for 40 days. The origin of the term quarantino, which later became quarantine in English. During this period, crews and cargo were monitored for signs of disease. These measures were not universally applied, and enforcement was inconsistent. But they represented one of the earliest systematic attempts at public health. The idea that society, not just individuals, could take action to prevent disease was slowly emerging. Other cities also experimented with isolation policies. In Genoa and Florence, authorities restricted movement of infected individuals and sometimes entire households. Certain towns even set up designated plague hospitals or lazarettos, separate facilities where the sick could be cared for away from the general population. While primitive by modern standards, these efforts marked a significant step toward organized public health. Changes in burial practices, The Black Death also forced societies to rethink how they handled death. Traditional burial practices could no longer keep pace with the number of corpses. Mass graves became common in many cities. In London, for example, parish records describe enormous pits where thousands of plague victims were buried together. The speed and scale of burials changed religious and social practices. Priests struggled to perform traditional funeral rites for everyone. Families sometimes had to bury loved ones themselves, or watch as bodies were interred hastily. Public cemeteries began to expand, and some towns instituted regulations to prevent the spread of disease from corpses, though understanding of transmission was rudimentary. These experiences contributed to a gradual awareness that sanitation and handling of the dead could affect public health. It was not yet a scientific understanding, but the practical lessons were beginning to sink in. The role of physicians and surgeons. Medical practitioners were in high demand during the Black Death, but their tools were limited. Physicians tried everything from herbal remedies and poultices to bleeding and cupping. Some recommended unusual diets or avoidance of certain foods thought to produce bad humors. Others suggested burning aromatic herbs or fumigating rooms to cleanse the air. In addition to physicians, barber surgeons played a crucial role. These were practitioners who performed minor surgeries, bloodletting, tooth extractions, and other manual medical procedures. Often, barber surgeons had no formal education, but were skilled with knives and scalpels. Literally, their work was dangerous, and in the case of plague patients, often deadly. Because of the overwhelming demand for medical care, some cities began to organize the profession more formally. Licensing systems were slowly introduced to regulate who could practice medicine. While still rudimentary, these measures reflected the recognition that public health required some structure. Plague and quarantine. Early public health policy. The recurring waves of plague after the initial outbreak in the 1350s forced European cities to take public health more seriously. Even though they lacked modern microbiology, city governments learned from experience. Venice became a pioneer. The city established the Lazaretto Vecchio, a quarantine station on an island near the city where arriving ships, crews, and cargo could be isolated for 40 days. Officials monitored arrivals for signs of disease. In addition to isolating potentially infected travelers, Venice required physicians to inspect incoming goods and ships. Other Italian cities, including Genoa and Florence, followed similar practices. These policies were motivated by trade interests. Disease outbreaks disrupted commerce, labor, and tax collection. Controlling epidemics was both a public health and an economic necessity. Some towns also experimented with cordons, sanitaires, or controlled borders around infected regions. Military-style enforcement could prevent travelers from entering plague zones, reducing the risk of further spread. While often harsh, these measures showed that authorities were beginning to recognize the relationship between population movement and disease. Social lessons in hygiene. The Black Death also influenced public behavior in more subtle ways. People became more conscious of sanitation, even if they did not understand germs. Streets that had previously been ignored received more attention. Waste was cleared more systematically, and public fountains or wells were sometimes regulated to prevent contamination. Personal hygiene practices also shifted. Survivors sometimes avoided contact with strangers or crowds during outbreaks. Masks, aromatic herbs, and fumigation became common, though people often misunderstood how disease actually spread. These practices, while scientifically naive by modern standards, nonetheless reduced some risk of transmission. The human response to uncertainty. It is important to recognize that the public health measures of the post-plague period were as much psychological as practical. Europeans had never faced mortality on this scale before. Fear was pervasive. Any action that suggested control, from isolating the sick to fumigating a house, provided a sense of agency in an otherwise uncontrollable world. In this way, public health became intertwined with social order. Governments and city officials had to demonstrate that they could protect populations or risk unrest. Measures like quarantine, burial regulations, and travel restrictions were as much about maintaining stability as they were about actual disease prevention. Knowledge that would shape the future. The medical lessons learned after the Black Death laid the groundwork for later developments in public health. While doctors still relied on incorrect theories of humors and miasmas, the experience established several crucial principles. Isolation works. Separating the sick from the healthy reduces the spread of disease. Travel spreads infection. Controlling the movement of people and goods can protect communities. Structured response is necessary. Coordinated action by authorities, whether city governments or monarchs, can save lives. Observation matters. Even without a scientific explanation, noticing patterns of infection can guide effective policies. These principles would influence future outbreaks, including later plague waves in the 14th and 15th centuries. Cities developed permanent quarantine stations, regulatory frameworks, and early public health boards. Over time, these practices evolved into more sophisticated systems that formed the foundation of modern epidemiology, medicine, mortality, and society. Perhaps the most profound lesson of all was the recognition of human vulnerability. The Black Death demonstrated that wealth, status, and religious devotion offered no guaranteed protection. Mortality was universal. This realization affected how people approached life and health. Some became more cautious, adopting preventative practices like avoiding sick individuals or purifying their homes. Others, confronted with life's fragility, embraced their remaining years with renewed vigor, contributing to cultural and economic developments in the later Middle Ages. Even though medical understanding remained limited, the Black Death forced Europe to think collectively about disease. No longer could communities rely solely on individual faith, prayers, or superstition. Coordinated social measures were necessary, a truth that would echo across centuries of epidemics. Legacy of medical lessons. In hindsight, the Black Death acted as both a medical catastrophe and a catalyst for public health awareness. The lessons learned were imperfect, incomplete, and often based on superstition, but they represented a critical shift in mindset. Cities like Venice, Florence, and Genoa pioneered quarantine and health regulations. Clergy and physicians documented symptoms, patterns, and mortality, slowly building empirical knowledge. Communities experimented with sanitation, isolation, and burial practices that would influence future generations. And in the long term, these developments helped prepare Europe for recurring plague waves, which would continue into the 17th century. Without the lessons learned after the Black Death, society's ability to respond to later epidemics would have been far weaker. By forcing Europeans to confront mortality, question medical authority, and develop coordinated responses, the plague reshaped both medicine and society. But disease was not the only area transformed in the aftermath. Trauma also appeared vividly in art and culture, as people sought to express grief, fear, and the fleeting nature of life in visual and literary forms. If there is one thing the Black Death made painfully clear, it's that life is short, unpredictable, and often cruel. And nowhere is that realization more visible than in the art and culture that emerged after the plague. Painters, sculptors, and writers began exploring themes that were once abstract or peripheral in medieval imagination and placed death, suffering, and human vulnerability at the very center. Medieval Europe had long been deeply religious, and its art largely reflected that. Church walls, altarpieces, and manuscripts were filled with depictions of saints, biblical narratives, and moral allegories. The goal was instructive as much as decorative, remind people of God's power, illustrate proper behavior, and inspire devotion. But the Black Death changed everything. Suddenly, death was no longer a distant, symbolic concept. It was immediate, personal, and universal. Kings died beside peasants. Priests died alongside their flocks, and whole families were wiped out in days. The scale of trauma demanded new ways of expression. Artists began capturing not just the divine or the ideal, but the fragile, fleeting, and terrifying reality of life itself. The Dance of Death, perhaps the most iconic artistic response to the plague, was the Danse Macabre, or Dance of Death. The concept was simple, chilling, and universally recognizable. Death comes for everyone, regardless of social status. In paintings, murals, and woodcuts, skeletal figures lead kings, merchants, peasants, and clergy in a grim procession toward the grave. The images were both macabre and moralistic, a visual reminder that earthly power and wealth could not protect anyone from mortality. The Dance of Death appeared in public spaces, often painted on church walls, where townspeople could see it every day. Some versions included inscriptions or verses, emphasizing moral lessons. Prepare your soul, for death spares none. The impact of these images was profound. They created a collective cultural memory of the plague, reinforcing a shared awareness of human vulnerability. Yet, the Dance of Death also carried an oddly democratizing message. Kings and paupers alike faced the same end. In a society obsessed with hierarchy and rank, that was a radical notion. Grim imagery and symbolism alongside the Dance of Death. Artists developed other motifs that reflected the trauma of the plague. Skeletons, corpses, and decaying bodies became common subjects. Religious iconography began to incorporate more explicit depictions of suffering. Saints and martyrs were sometimes portrayed in moments of extreme agony, emphasizing the universality of pain. Even in literature, the plague left its mark. Poets and chroniclers wrote about mass mortality, the fragility of human life, and the capriciousness of fate. One notable example is Boccaccio's Decameron, written in the 1350s. While often humorous or romantic in tone, it is framed by the reality of the plague. 10 young people flee Florence to escape the disease and tell stories to pass the time. The work captures a mix of fear, wit, and resilience, showing how people coped with catastrophe through storytelling, imagination, and human connection. This approach, blending tragedy with observation, humor, and moral reflection, would influence European literature for centuries. Shifts in patronage and style. The Black Death also altered who commissioned art, and what kind of art was created. Before the plague, most commissions came from the church or aristocracy. Religious institutions were the main patrons, funding altarpieces, frescoes, and manuscripts. Wealthy nobles also commissioned decorative works to display status and power. After the plague, The surviving population included a growing number of urban middle-class citizens, merchants, skilled artisans, and independent farmers who had acquired land and wealth. Many of these survivors wanted to express their faith in prosperity, but also their personal experience of the plague. This led to new kinds of commissions. Private chapels, personal devotional books, and memorial sculptures became more common. Art increasingly reflected individual piety, personal grief, and a fascination with mortality. The rise of a middle class created a market for works that were smaller, more intimate, and more personal than the grand projects of earlier centuries. Funerary art and memorials. Another major development was in funerary art. The Black Death had killed millions, leaving families desperate to memorialize loved ones. Tombs, gravestones, and monuments often included explicit references to mortality, skulls, skeletons, and inscriptions urging viewers to consider their own death. In some regions, large communal monuments commemorated victims of the plague. Churches and cemeteries became spaces where the collective trauma of the population was expressed visually. These works served both spiritual and social functions. They honored the dead, reminded the living of the fragility of life, and reinforced moral and religious lessons about preparation for the afterlife. The focus on mortality also influenced the iconography of saints. Saints who had once been celebrated for miraculous interventions were increasingly depicted in ways that emphasized human suffering, endurance, and compassion. The plague reshaped the meaning of sainthood itself. It was no longer enough to perform miracles. Saints were now models of resilience in the face of unavoidable death. Literature and the fragility of life. The impact of the Black Death on literature was equally significant. Chroniclers documented the scale of mortality, the fear, and the societal upheaval. Authors explored themes of unpredictability, fate, and human fragility. Some writers used humor and irony as coping mechanisms, while others reflected solemnly on death. The duality of these approaches mirrored the social reality of the time. People were grieving, terrified, and yet desperate to continue living, working, and loving. The Decameron, as mentioned earlier, is a perfect example. The book acknowledges death and suffering, but pairs these themes with clever stories, romance, and wit. This combination of tragedy and humanism became a hallmark of Renaissance literature. Similarly, chroniclers like Jean de Venette and Ibn Khaldun provided first-hand accounts of the plague, blending observation, social commentary, and moral reflection. Their work ensured that the trauma of the Black Death would not be forgotten and influenced how later historians, writers, and artists approached catastrophe. Cultural shifts in the Renaissance, the artistic and literary transformations after the Black Death, did more than document suffering. They also reflected changing values and priorities. Surviving populations began to place more emphasis on human experience, the beauty of life, and the importance of individual achievement. This shift helped lay the groundwork for the Renaissance. Artists like Giotto, Masaccio, and later Botticelli explored realism, human emotion, and the natural world in ways that had been less common before the plague. The focus on mortality and the fleeting nature of life intensified interest in human potential, perspective, and creativity. The Danse Macabre, morbid as it may seem, encouraged reflection on both death and life. By confronting mortality, artists and audiences began to value the present more consciously. This attitude, balancing awareness of death with celebration of life, became a defining feature of Renaissance humanism, humor, satire, and the human response. Interestingly, the trauma of the plague also gave rise to a subtle kind of dark humor. Satirical illustrations, plays, and stories poked fun at human folly, social pretension, and even death itself. In a society that had witnessed death on a massive scale, humor became a coping mechanism. It allowed people to process grief while finding ways to continue daily life. Some artworks combined grim imagery with witty commentary. Skeletons might be shown mocking the living, or wealthy figures might be portrayed as helpless before death. These images reminded viewers that wealth, power, or social status could not protect them, and the humor softened the horror just enough to make reflection possible. Art as collective memory. One of the most important roles of post-plague art was to create a collective memory. The Black Death was not an isolated event. It transformed the landscape, economy, religion, and daily life. Art became a way to record and process that transformation. Murals, illuminated manuscripts, frescoes, and woodcuts preserved the experience of fear, grief, and survival. They told future generations that life was fragile, that societies could be upended in months, and that humans needed both resilience and moral awareness to endure catastrophe. In this sense, art served as both memorial and lesson. It reminded survivors to prepare for the inevitable, while also celebrating the resilience of those who had endured. Conclusion. Culture forged in the shadow of death, the Black Death reshaped medieval European art and culture in profound ways. It introduced darker themes into artistic expression, emphasizing death, suffering, and the universality of mortality. It expanded patronage beyond the church and nobility, allowing middle-class citizens to commission works reflecting personal experience and devotion. It encouraged literature and storytelling that combined tragedy with human resilience, wit, and moral reflection. And in doing so, it helped lay the foundation for the Renaissance. By confronting the fragility of life, post-plague art encouraged a deeper appreciation of human potential, creativity, and the beauty of the world that remained. The plague may have killed millions, but in its wake, survivors created a cultural legacy that endured for centuries. The world that emerged was not the same as the one that had existed before 1347. Pain, grief, and trauma had transformed the way people thought, saw, and expressed themselves, forging a new consciousness that would shape European art, literature, and philosophy for generations. If there's one area of European life that the Black Death reshaped permanently, it was the economy. The plague didn't just kill millions of people. It disrupted trade, labor, agriculture, and urban life. When the disease subsided, survivors faced a world where old economic systems were no longer sustainable. From wages to land use, from urban markets to rural villages, the Black Death forced Europe to rethink how it produced wealth, how labor was valued, and how society distributed resources. Immediate economic shock. When the plague swept through Europe between 1347 and 1351, it killed an estimated 30 to 50% of the population. Entire towns were depopulated. Farms went untended. Trade networks were disrupted as merchants, sailors, and craftsmen fell ill or died. Cities like Florence, Paris, and London saw massive declines in population. For the survivors, daily life became a mix of fear and opportunity. The immediate economic effects were devastating for some. Landowners lost workers and revenue, businesses faced collapse, and governments saw tax income drop sharply. But for others, especially laborers, the situation created new possibilities. With fewer people to work the land or produce goods, surviving workers suddenly became highly valuable. In towns and villages across Europe, wages began to rise. The basic principle of supply and demand, though informal at the time, suddenly applied to human labor in ways it never had before. The value of labor. Before the Black Death, labor in medieval Europe was largely constrained by the feudal system. Serfs were tied to the land and owed labor to their lords. Peasants had limited mobility and little leverage to demand better wages or conditions. Life for the average worker was harsh, predictable, and economically fixed. After the plague, that balance shifted dramatically. Landowners still had estates to manage, but with half the workforce gone, they struggled to keep fields planted, animals tended, and rents collected. Meanwhile, surviving laborers found themselves in a position of unprecedented bargaining power. Wages for agricultural laborers in England, for example, rose sharply. Skilled craftsmen and artisans could demand higher pay. Rural workers were no longer trapped on a single lord's estate. They could move to towns or regions offering better compensation. In Italy, merchants and skilled laborers also benefited from shortages, increasing their influence and wealth. This rise in wages represented more than just financial gain. It signaled the weakening of feudal constraints. The social hierarchy, previously rigid, began to bend under economic pressure. Labor was no longer taken for granted, and peasants could assert some control over their own lives. Land and agriculture. The labor shortage also prompted dramatic changes in land use. Large estates that had once relied on dozens or hundreds of serfs struggled to maintain their productivity. Many landowners responded by shifting from labor-intensive arable farming to pastoral farming, especially sheep herding. Sheep were valuable for wool, which fueled Europe's growing textile industry, and required fewer workers to manage. Converting fields from crops to pasture allowed landowners to maintain profitability despite a shrinking workforce. Some estates were leased to tenant farmers who assumed responsibility for labor and management. This arrangement reduced the burden on the landowner and gave tenants a degree of autonomy. Over time, this contributed to the decline of traditional serfdom in many regions. In addition, abandoned villages and farmland created opportunities for consolidation and innovation. Survivors could acquire land at relatively low cost, and entrepreneurial farmers experimented with new crops, techniques, and property arrangements. In effect, the plague forced a reconsideration of how land could be used most efficiently. Urban recovery and trade. Cities, too, experienced significant economic transformation. Urban centers had lost large portions of their populations, including merchants, artisans, and laborers. Initially, this caused a sharp decline in production and trade. Shops closed, markets emptied, and guilds struggled to maintain standards, but urban life proved resilient. Survivors migrated from rural areas to cities seeking employment and higher wages. Skilled artisans found opportunities to establish workshops, while merchants expanded trade networks to fill gaps left by deceased competitors. Guilds, which regulated crafts and trade, adapted to the new reality. Membership rules became more flexible to allow for labor shortages, and training programs for apprentices were adjusted. Cities gradually recovered economically, but the social composition of urban life changed. Wealth was concentrated among fewer individuals, often those who had survived the plague and capitalized on new opportunities. Taxes and government revenue. The economic transformations of the post-plague period also affected governments. With a smaller population, traditional tax systems became less effective. Land taxes, tithes, and feudal dues generated less revenue, forcing monarchs and local authorities to seek alternative methods. Some rulers experimented with direct taxation of wealth, trade, or urban property. Others tried to control wages and prices through legislation. England, for example, passed the Statute of Laborers in 1351, attempting to freeze wages at pre-plague levels. Similar measures appeared elsewhere in Europe. These policies were largely ineffective. Laborers could move to regions offering higher pay, and enforcement was difficult. The gap between official regulations and economic reality highlighted the limitations of medieval governance and foreshadowed the rise of more centralized state control in later centuries. The rise of a market economy, the labor shortage, shifts in land use, and urban migration all contributed to the gradual emergence of a market-based economy. By the late 14th and early 15th centuries, Europe saw a notable transition from feudal obligations toward wage labor, tenant farming, and trade-driven production. Merchants, artisans, and farmers increasingly operated within a monetary economy. Contracts, wages, and rents became standard ways of organizing labor and production. Money replaced obligations and labor, creating flexibility for both workers and employers. This transition did not happen overnight, but it laid the foundation for economic modernization. The rigid structures of feudalism were giving way to a more dynamic, fluid system in which labor, property, and commerce were increasingly governed by market forces rather than tradition alone. Inequality and opportunity. The economic changes after the Black Death had complex social consequences. On the one hand, surviving laborers and artisans enjoyed unprecedented opportunities. Peasants could acquire land, earn higher wages, and sometimes even accumulate wealth. Urban merchants and skilled craftsmen prospered in recovering cities. On the other hand, not everyone benefited equally. Wealth was increasingly concentrated among those who had survived and positioned themselves advantageously. Landowners who successfully converted to pasture or leased property to tenants retained power, while those who failed economically could lose everything. Moreover, the instability sometimes provoked social unrest. Rising wages and the erosion of traditional obligations created tension between workers and elites. Revolts, like the Peasants' Revolt of 1381 in England, reflected the friction between a newly empowered working class and a traditional aristocracy struggling to maintain control. Trade and the international economy. The plague also reshaped trade networks. Italian city-states like Venice, Genoa, and Florence recovered more quickly than many northern European regions, partly due to their role in Mediterranean commerce. Surviving merchants expanded their reach, importing luxury goods, textiles, and spices. Northern Europe saw similar trends in smaller-scale trade. Flanders, for instance, became a hub for wool and cloth production, benefiting from the labor adjustments in England and other regions. International trade gradually recovered, though outbreaks of plague in subsequent decades continued to disrupt markets. The result was a more interconnected economy. Cities, regions, and nations increasingly depended on one another for labor, goods, and capital. The Black Death, by reducing population and altering production, accelerated these changes, moving Europe toward the early modern commercial economy. Long-term economic consequences by the early 15th century. Europe's economic landscape had been profoundly transformed. Labor became scarce and valuable. Workers could demand wages, negotiate conditions, and move between regions. feudal obligations declined. Serfdom weakened, and wage-based labor became increasingly common. Land use shifted. Farms consolidated, arable fields were converted to pasture, and tenant farming expanded. Urban economies strengthened. Cities recovered, trade networks expanded, and artisans and merchants gained influence. Market principles emerged. Monetary exchange, contracts, and wage labor began to replace purely traditional obligations. Social tension persisted. Economic opportunity for some created unrest for others, occasionally leading to revolts and social reform. The Black Death acted as a catalyst, accelerating changes that might otherwise have taken centuries to occur. By dramatically altering population, labor supply, and economic expectations, it pushed Europe toward a more dynamic, market-driven society, preparing for the future. Perhaps the most important lesson of the economic aftermath was resilience. Survivors had to adapt quickly. Landowners experimented with new production methods. Laborers leveraged scarcity into opportunity. Merchants found ways to rebuild trade networks. Governments attempted to regulate wages and taxes, even if enforcement often failed. The Black Death taught medieval Europe that economies were fragile, and that demographic shocks could fundamentally alter power relationships. Those lessons would echo in later centuries, informing responses to famine, war, and future epidemics. Ultimately, the plague did more than kill people. Reshaped the rules of survival, work, and prosperity. By transforming the economy, it also reshaped society, contributing to the emergence of a more flexible, mobile, and modern Europe. As the devastation of the Black Death slowly faded from Europe, the world that remained was forever changed. Entire communities had vanished, old systems were shaken, and the balance of power between workers, nobles, and kings began to shift in ways few people at the time could have imagined. For the survivors, life didn't simply return to the way it was before. Instead, the aftermath of the plague helped reshape society, open new opportunities, and gradually push the medieval world toward a very different future. History is full of moments like this, times when tragedy transforms the course of human life in unexpected ways. And the story of what happened after the Black Death is one of the most fascinating examples. If you enjoyed this calm journey through history, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel for more relaxing historical stories. It really helps the channel grow and allows us to keep exploring these incredible moments from the past. Also, I'd love to hear from you. Leave a comment below and tell me what historical topic you'd like to see in a future video. And if you're in the mood for another peaceful trip into the past, be sure to check out the next video on your screen, where we explore another surprising story from history. Thanks for watching, and until next time, sleep well, and I'll see you in the next chapter of history.